Throughout the span of First Peoples history and culture, it is recognised that the health and well-being of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have been greatly impacted by ongoing policy implementations.
In the first half of the 20th century, right up until the late 1960s, the Australian government introduced the assimilation policy, sought to create a single, uniform, white Australian culture, going to great lengths both physically and immorally to in essence strive to eradicate the Indigenous people of Australia. As opposed to the assimilation era, the paradigm shift within the Australian population has seen a plethora of new, innovative, government-supported programs and policies.
One of which being the Indigenous Advancement Strategy introduced in 2014. This policy adopts a strength-based approach that centralises the importance of cultural determinants and the empowerment of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community.
Within this presentation, the two contrasting policies will be further discussed and analysed as to how the contemporary health system and current well-being of the Indigenous community has been impacted as a whole.
The policy of Aboriginal assimilation came to fruition in the 1950s and lasted an entire decade. The Australian government employed a catalogue of racial and cultural vilification techniques to in turn strive to complete the task of ethnic neutralisation of not only the physical embodiment of the Indigenous people, but also the eradication of the Indigenous culture as a whole. The effects of assimilation during the 1950s was felt by many Indigenous communities, where Indigenous children were simply removed from their homes against their mother's will and taken to missions to be raised and educated. Throughout this policy era, it was the common ethnic belief that the Indigenous people would simply die out. However, this was not the case, ultimately highlighting the resilience and strength of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in which they prevailed through a time of such hardship. This era in turn saw Indigenous people torn away from their families and culture, with the scars of these acts still affecting the mental and physical health of the Indigenous community to this day.
First Peoples health means not just the physical well-being of an individual, but refers to the social, emotional, and cultural well-being of the community as a whole. As previously discussed, the assimilation policy which took place during the 1950s and 60s enabled the forcible removal of Indigenous children from their families and saw an increase in racism and segregation. During this time, the Indigenous population experienced not just social and emotional hardship, but also the loss of liberties and basic human rights. These past atrocities created long-term physical and psychological effects on Indigenous people that are often transgenerational. As a result, the transmission of trauma across generations has created a profound disadvantage in the scheme of contemporary healthcare for First Peoples. Transmission of trauma can deter people from achieving their full capabilities by debilitating self-confidence and self-worth, which in turn leads to poorer health outcomes and barriers.
Furthermore, there are a number of health conditions that significantly contribute to the disparity in the health status between First Peoples and the non-Indigenous population.
As seen, external causes of mortality such as physiological stress and suicide within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community is more than double of that of the non-Indigenous people. This highlights a major health issue within the Indigenous community where isolation and neglection is significantly linked to the risk of developing mental illness, poor physical health, and coping behaviours such as alcohol and substance misuse. This is also identified in the prevalence of respiratory disease, nutritional disorders, and digestive disease as opposed to non-Indigenous communities. The transgenerational trauma and racism associated with the assimilation policy presents a current barrier in building trustful and respectful relationships with First Peoples and health professionals.
Evidence suggests that racism experienced in the delivery of health services contributes to low levels of access to health services by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Key limitations are the lack of recognition for the trauma and ongoing racism experienced by the First Peoples of Australia. As a result of such, communication issues and distrust between Indigenous and non-Indigenous health professionals may arise.
So, at this point, you may be wondering what's being done to resolve the ongoing impact of assimilation and the past policies. So, for this part of the presentation, we are aiming to focus on the Indigenous Advancement Strategy and the impact of this policy in regards to improving the health and well-being of the Indigenous community.
The Indigenous Advancement Strategy was implemented in 2014 with the task of advancing the Indigenous people within the field of employment, economic and social participation in the aim to increase the quality of life for Indigenous peoples and their community. This policy intends to prepare Indigenous children through promoting positive habits in such areas as attending school, in conjunction with Australian businesses becoming more open and actively supplying jobs to Indigenous people. The concept of this policy emphasises connection to the community and country, reinforcement of positive health behaviours, protection of traditional knowledge and practices, and improvement of social and emotional well-being within their communities.
The Indigenous Advancement Strategy prioritises government funding to ensure health systems are accessible, culturally safe and appropriate, and are effective and responsive for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
This health plan approach has seen a positive movement within the Indigenous community, with a number of regional and interstate programs being active avenues of change.
The Deadly Choices campaign is one of many initiatives which focuses on holistic health promotion for urban Indigenous communities. Deadly Choices recognises the achievements of Australian First Peoples and empowers the community to make deadly health choices such as quitting smoking, sustaining good nutrition, and regular exercise. This particular campaign also encourages access to local community-controlled health service to complete an annual health check. As seen, current reports identify a steady progress in reaching closing the gap targets in areas of education and child mortality.
It can be recognised that the Indigenous Advancement Strategy provides a necessary platform to actively improve health equality in the near future.
So what sets aside the Indigenous Advancement Strategy from past policies?
Well, it's a collaborative movement, so it ultimately puts the power back into the people, which therefore has a major beneficial impact on delivery and execution of the health plan.
The policy not only focuses on educating the Indigenous community, but also non-Indigenous Australians that are in a role of providing primary healthcare. To ensure the Australian health system is free of racism and inequality, it is essential that providers acknowledge the legacy of intergenerational trauma and communicate in a respectful and engaging manner. By ensuring that health services and providers are culturally competent, it can be expected that effective service delivery will be improved, which therefore leads to better health outcomes for the Indigenous population.
Throughout the span of First Peoples' history and culture, it is recognised that the health and well-being of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have been greatly impacted by ongoing policy implementation. The two policies discussed within this presentation show two very opposing strategies that the Australian government has put forward in regards to Indigenous affairs, in turn having either a detrimental effect on the health and well-being of Indigenous people in the case of the assimilation policy, in comparison to the positive effect that the Indigenous Advancement Strategy of 2014 is producing in today's world. In conclusion, it is clear to see that past political policies have had a huge detrimental effect on the Indigenous community. However, more modern thinking has led to new improved policies such as the Indigenous Advancement Strategy that is now in turn working to provide equal and just opportunities for the Indigenous populace.